Welcome to the Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up on this episode, the documentary filmmaker Michael Epstein, director of Final Cut, The Making and Unmaking of Heaven's Gate, is here to discuss the various cuts of Heaven's Gate. You got it. We're talking 4 different cuts of the 3.5 hour movie. But first, what I watched this week, I recorded a bunch of episodes this week, which entailed watching 4 cuts of a 3.5 hour movie, but also a bunch of reading and other stuff coming up. So I didn't get to watch much unrelated to future episodes. The only thing I actually watched this week unrelated was I finally got around to Mike Nichols' film Silkwood, which we talked about a little on the Mike Nichols commentary episode, very, very briefly. Mark Harris's new book, Mike Nichols, A Life. I've seen in interviews Mark Harris has said he thinks Silkwood is one of Nichols' best movies and is definitely interesting. Obviously, it got Oscar nominations in its day, and it has a very unaffected, doesn't have the high class sheen that Nichols normally puts in his filmmaking. So that aspect was definitely interesting. I know Harris in particular has lamented. We on this show we constantly have the physical versus streaming debate, and he pointed out that Silkwood isn't available for streaming right now. It took me a while to get what still have a lingering Netflix DVD rental thing from DVD.com, and even then it was a long wait, so it took a while to get. All this is going to say, still buy physical if you can. But the story of the week I found interesting was the Hollywood Reporter expose on Scott Rudin. And if you haven't read it yet, I mean, there's a vibe that when the headline came out, at least on Twitter, was like a jokey non-surprise that the rumors around Scott Rudin were true. Or when I started reading it, there's details about one intern staffer who got seriously injured when a computer was thrown at him. And I remembered I've known 2 friends over the years who have worked for Scott Rudin. And I remember one of them actually told me, they told it to me in an innocuous way. And this is what they told me. So this isn't verbatim truth, obviously. This is just what was relayed to me. But the computer story sounded very similar happening to them, but only a little more innocent and innocuous. But I think there was, I misremember the story too, but I think there was a destroyed computer at some point. Going a long way to say that one of the things that I thought of immediately was that didn't get enough play was the statement from when Harvey Weinstein first started going down. The Weinstein Company staffers wrote a collective statement that was supposedly from 30 company members, unsigned specifically, but there's a passage in there that stuck with me that I wanted to read right now. This is from the statement. As we begin the painful process of reflecting on our industry and the ugly systems we've wrought and let thrive, we are asking ourselves the question, how do we define abuse? Do we include verbal degradation, ruthless aggression, and physical intimidation? This particular horror show centers on a sexual predator who abused his power in a very specific way. But if we're being honest, and if not now, when? We all know that threatening, hostile, inhumane work environments are rampant in our industry. Non-disclosure agreements only perpetuate this culture of silence. The "if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen" mentality undermines those who might have spoken out. We treat these abusive people and places as rites of passage instead of with the disgust they deserve. And with that, we are now moving on to discuss the great, giant project full of folly, the amazing movie that I'm not sure too many people have seen, and when they do see it, they treat it as a rite of passage in of itself, which I don't know how to tell you you're missing out on something if you can manage not to look at this movie as a chore. This really is one of the greatest movies ever made. We are now talking Heaven's Gate. Was Final Cut your second movie? At least it's listed on IMDb in that.
Oh, no. But... No, so I had come out of Michigan thinking I wanted to do movies. I mean, that was it. And I moved thinking, I'll do documentary for a little bit, but I really want to transfer over to narrative, which has not yet happened. But I left school with a film in mind, based on Pauline Kael's book about Citizen Kane, which
has anything happened with that lately?
So it's my Academy Award nomination. Actually, I made a documentary about it called "The Battle Over Citizen Kane," which Ridley Scott optioned.
Which is our KO 281?
281, right.
Yeah, we did an episode on Raising Cain, actually.
Did you? Oh, yeah. I've been, so I have a documentary, which for a while was the bonus DVD of Citizen Kane.
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar with that because that has that cool Roger Ebert commentary on the actual movie too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there was like a couple of years ago, so I think it was, I forget, it was when Turner owned the rights to the film, and they released a DVD. So my film with Tom Lennon, who was my mentor for 6 years. I mean, Tom was the driving force behind that too, and Richard Ben Kramer, who's no longer with us, but Tom was the director, and along with me, the lead director, I should say. And it told the story of Hearst and Wells and Mankiewicz, and then Ridley Scott bought it and made a film with Liev Schreiber, which was based on nothing that I could tell from the documentary or from anything. They just made it up as they went along. And
shocker, yeah.
Yeah, and then now Fincher's got his movie out.
That was the joke I was going with. So if film school wasn't initially in the cards, but you initially jumped into medium about movies, were you a big movie person growing up?
Yeah. I'm like the guy that rented the 16. I mean, I'm old, so we would have to rent. This is I remember getting the first VHS player, like that my dad brought home.
Okay.
And it was the size of our kitchen table. It was just so huge. But the idea that you could see movies on demand, it blew my mind. But I'm the guy that watched Harold and Maude 16, 17 times in high school over and over and over again, and would rent the 16 millimeter print. And at Michigan, one of the really, really great things that I remember incredibly fondly, we had a core group of friends, and there were film societies all over school, all over the campus, and multiple ones. And they would have a booklet that every film society would say, on Friday night we're showing this Bergman movie or this Woody Allen movie or, whatever it is. And we would sit down and we would try to figure out where we're going to go and see. And we would see 2, 3, 4 time movies a weekend at Michigan. Yeah, we just loved it.
Did Heaven's Gate, would you have been in college when Heaven's Gate came out, or?
No, I'm not that old, thank God. No, I was in
Cheers.
Middle school. So Heaven's Gate came out in 80, right? Yeah.
But although I'm still unsure about what its wide release was, or if it really ever had one.
Didn't really have one, right?
That's what I get. So
the short version, I think, had a wide-ish release. They pulled it right away. They had such a disastrous premiere.
Yeah, I mentioned in my emails to you earlier, I just watched 3 cuts of the movie in 3 days, and including just finally, I think I saw the theatrical version for the first time today. Yeah. But so when did you first finally see it?
I must have seen it as some bastardized VHS at some point and thought it was terrible.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. It seems to be a lot of people's first reaction.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. It has a short film. It's not a short story. And that version, it's a funny thing too. Sometimes movies work when you're immersed in them in a movie theater. And, watching it 4:3 at an old SD thing with a VHS with the vertical tracking not working is just not the great way to watch that film, or McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or just any of these great pictures.
I'm glad you mentioned McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I find there's a few poetic, long, expensive westerns that I find this is a genre of,
Yeah.
and or in case of like where McCabe and Mrs. Miller are this, ones with like really hard to hear audio tracks where the dialogue is obscured, but they're also shot by Vilmos Zsigmond through a lot of filters and very pretty.
Right. Right.
Um,
He flashed the film, I think, in that he flashed the negative for that one,
yeah,
I
yeah.
think. And I put this with the same category. There were a whole host of films at that time, and I do remember going to the movie theater with my dad to see Reds and just being completely blown away by Reds. I mean, still to this day, it's one of my absolute favorite films. I mean,
That's a movie that we brought up many times on
yeah,
here. That's a favorite of mine too.
I just love that movie, and I think Heaven's Gate is something in that same. Well, it's almost within the same couple of years, right?
Right.
And the same feel, the same idea of immersive history. I don't think So at some point, I went back and I started looking at it, and I became friends with Steven Bach, and one of my very, very best friends growing up, and still to this day, had read Final Cut, and he like put it in my hands, and he was like, "You're gonna love this book." And so I loved Steven's book, and then I met Steven, and he was a great guy. He was a really wonderful man.
That's nice to hear.
He was kind and generous and really thoughtful and smart. He taught at Columbia, and I had made The Battle Over Citizen Kane for PBS with Tom, and then I went independent and I made a film about the transition from the Hollywood studio system to the auteur theory of filmmaking.
Okay.
Through the creative relationship of David O. Selznick and Alfred Hitchcock, because people forget or didn't know that Hitchcock came over to America as a contract player to Selznick. And
Selznick has that really great book of memos that just came out like 20 years ago, I think.
Right. I mean, Selznick was just this crazy, tragic, pill-popping lunatic of a guy.
On Benzedrine, just watching cuts over and over and giving notes.
Yeah. Yeah. And, really, the guy who could not escape his success. He was just completely overwhelmed and burdened by how big Gone with the Wind was. And, it always fascinated me about like someone like James Cameron or Steven Spielberg, who kind of moved on from Titanic and made something bigger, right? I mean, whatever you think of Avatar, it was like,
right.
That was not the last thing he did, and
there always does seem. I don't know how Spielberg works with this because he was such a big director so young, but Cameron, has his early years of poverty, and they always say don't have success too early.
Yeah,
like you need a little few years of humility involved.
Right, and he had films that didn't work in between. So he had things like Aliens that was a big box office success in the Terminator franchise, but was it
the Abyss is the theatrical version of The Abyss is something. I mean, I'm
right.
The special edition I'm a fan of.
I agree.
So we're okay. So you your feelings on Heaven's Gate still to this day is that you don't think it works?
Oh, no. So eventually I got to see the long version of it. And I love so much of it. I think it's a very misunderstood film and an unfairly derided film. And, for me, I would rather watch an interesting mistake than a boring success. I would rather watch a film that takes incredible risks and has real vision than something that's just kind of like easy, innocuous, that's studio fare or, consciously commercial. And Heaven's Gate, to me, is just one high wire act after another.
3.5 hours of high wire act.
I think it's bloated at times. I've never liked the Harvard opening. I think that the end on the boat doesn't work well, but there are moments in it that just blow my mind. And some of the writing, a lot of the acting, and Vilmos's cinematography is
Yeah.
among the most remarkable, I think, cinematography in any film ever. I mean, David Lean level brilliant.
I think there's a period where Zygmunt in the 70s is just unparalleled. Like, he's just one movie that you need to buy a Blu-ray or a print of to watch over and over, and a restored one. Because, like, the fade, like, especially you mentioned the flashing earlier, when it fades, but, like, you get it restored and crisp.
That was actually, I can say, like, there were a few real highlights when I made the documentary. One of them was going to a Starbucks with Vilmos in Santa Monica, because I had reached out to him and I was like, look, I'm doing this thing. Michael's not helping. I don't know if I can do this without you. And he was the nicest man you can't ever imagine. I mean, he was just, he came out to Starbucks. We sat and we talked for like 2 hours, and, we talked about how much we loved the movie and his technique. And then he said to me, I have all these Polaroids. Because back in the day, that was the only way they could.
That's your light meter.
That was your light meter, right? And he had a book of like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Polaroid images, which effectively track the entire movie, including like tons of stuff from behind the scenes.
Wow.
And I was like, I would love to see them. And he said, you can have them. I was like, what?
Have them?
Well, use them. I couldn't own them. So I took them and I put them on a flatbed or a drum scanner. I brought them into some place and spent thousands and thousands of dollars scanning all these Polaroid images and putting them on a drive, and gave Vilmos a copy of the drive and his originals back. And that was the only way I could make the documentary.
Did you ever end up talking to Cimino or Joanne Corelli?
I talked to Joanne a couple times, but never to Michael. I could never penetrate.
Like
Michael.
Not even an email or a friendly, I'm not interested?
Everything was communicated through Joanne. So I reached out to Joanne and I talked to Joanne and spoke to her quite a bit. And what I said to them was, I love this movie and I want it to be reconsidered. I think you were unfairly maligned. The film's framed in the worst possible light, as a flop that sunk a studio, which is technically not true.
Yeah.
Right.
I hate that narrative, but whatever.
And at the time, a gentleman who's no longer with us, Bingham Ray, was the head of MGM. And I met with Bingham, my producer, and I did. And he's like, I love this idea. Because, MGM owned the print. And we really didn't feel like we could make the documentary without their permission. Because we didn't want to make it without showing the movie. Right? Clips from the film.
Right.
Which are insanely expensive. I mean, there's a reason why you don't see more documentaries about Hollywood movies, because they're just, you have to do the Directors Guild and then all the actors, and then you got to pay for the clips. I mean, each minute can cost as much as $10,000, right? Back then.
Is it a case where you want to get a studio on your side to say, I want to revitalize this, and it's a home video title maybe that you might be able to?
Yeah, so that's what happened. Bingham was like, that's great. And he called up a guy named John Kirk, who was running the MGM restoration department. And John was like, oh my God, I've wanted to do a restoration of Heaven's Gate since I arrived.
His name's come up in some of the stuff I've read too. Yeah.
He's a really great guy. And John and I started to work together. And so he did a full restoration of Heaven's Gate while, and really for the documentary. And then Bingham got fired. And I didn't have anything in writing. I just had this handshake with Bingham, and I thought it was all okay because John was doing a big restoration. And
what time period is this?
Oh my God, 2004 maybe.
Is
like
that when the MGM DVD came out, or this would
it came out right after?
Would have come out from the John Kirk restoration?
Exactly. Okay. So when that DVD, I was the spark of that.
Nice.
It was, and even Michael wouldn't at that point participate in the film. I was like, I got your film fucking restored, dude.
Right.
Give me an interview. And as I joke, a pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph, and MGM just said, we have nothing to do with this documentary. Screw you. Whatever deal you had with Bingham we're not honoring it. And it was a nightmare. We finally solved it, but I was never able to afford my own DVD release because they allowed me to use the film clips for broadcast, and we broadcast it on a digital platform called
Is this on Oxygen? Was it on?
It was called Trio.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember.
So long gone. Yeah. And who was the executive of it? Oddly enough, he was a great guy, Andy Cohen of Bravo.
Okay. Wow. Wow. There's a lot of circularity there. So okay, let me going into my history with Heaven's Gate. I think I came to Final Cut first, the book, and
I think a lot of people did. I certainly did.
Okay, that's not an unfamiliar path. Good to know. It has that pull quote on the cover for Pauline Kael. That's very alluring. And I got maybe a few pages in, and I was like, okay, I should see the movie. And I feel like the DVD had. This doesn't fit the timeline because I think it's like around 2000, 2001. I don't know if I found a VHS of it, but I would think maybe it was the DVD. I don't remember. And I remember watching it and thinking, like it was an accomplishment that I watched it. Like I felt like I read a really long book, and like a book that like is worth it. But it was a long book, and I didn't really think much about it throughout the years. I finished the book. I love the book. Steven Bach is, for someone who's telling all these like cool behind the scenes Hollywood stories, just as a like stylist, he's such a great writer, and he's it's nice to know that what you were saying about him personally too jibes with this too. He just seems like an observant, very sophisticated sensibility. And
that was Steven, very much Steven.
There's so much good stuff in the book just in general about not related to Heaven's Gate. I mean, there's great film history, there's great MGM history. I love the Raging Bull anecdotes throughout the story, like the whole one of De Niro like defending Raging Bull and being like, Jake LaMotta is not a cockroach. Like there's so many little tiny stories, just sprinkled in. Anyway, and so throughout the years, I tried to watch more Cimino, but I've always avoided Deer Hunter. And the first one I watched that I liked was Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, which was okay. It's short, it's charming, it's unchallenging. Eastwood's great in it.
It's an Eastwood movie, really.
Yeah, and it's Eastwood in his peak period too, where like it makes sense.
And Jeff Bridges is pretty good in that movie too.
Yeah, and Jeff Bridges in the 70s especially, like he's always good. I don't remember much of Year in the Dragon. I watched Desperate Hours a few years ago and remember nothing of it. I have never seen Sun Chaser. I have the director's cut of Sicilian. I held out on the Sicilian because one of the other big, which is at the end of Final Cut, the Z Channel documentary talks about how they push the longer cut, at least in Los Angeles. And in there, FX Feeney talks up the Sicilian director's cut that there's a story in that documentary where they flew to Paris to watch it just because, and they talked about how witty the movie was. It's okay. But really what it was I finally sat down and watched a HD version of Deer Hunter in my old setup when I was a projectionist. We used to put like HD cable networks onto the digital projectors when we had the first digital projectors. And we watched a copy of Deer Hunter, which I'd never seen. And not only that movie just take me away and captivate me, but in some ways I feel
the wedding scene.
The wedding sequence, and how hypnotic and great filmmaking is, and how long it is, but how much. I mean, one of the things that I really noticed this last few viewings of Cimino stuff, that when he makes these long, bloated movies, is he gives so much time that storytellers want to typically go for conflict. Cimino goes towards seeing these people happy and sees them enjoy, because he wants to do this Edenic stuff that's going to show whenever the tragedy happens or whenever violence happens, how sad it is that it happens to him. But he loves to watch these people happy. Deer Hunter taught me how to watch Heaven's Gate. And to be fair, I didn't jump right away to watch Heaven's Gate again. It wasn't until the Criterion release. And I think, I don't know, do you have an opinion that the Criterion release might have like brought more people onto Heaven's Gate, or the Heaven's Gate bandwagon?
Well, I think, there's, you mentioned the LA Z channel, right? The which is this iconic public access channel for people who don't know. I think they were the ones they were the original outlet for the long version. I think that the long version was basically lost until they programmed it, I believe. And
the Z channel documentary is a great documentary, and a very sad documentary too. But
anyway, so I think the thing about Heaven's Gate is that it had a couple of these moments where it gets reclaimed. The first being Z channel in LA. And then eventually, John does his restoration, which does okay. I don't think it changes the narrative very much at all. Our film and Michael's film was at Film Forum in New York at the same time. So I had a theatrical release along with Heaven's Gate. And our review was great for us and terrible for Heaven's Gate. I think it was they still couldn't break the narrative that it was.
They couldn't get past the New York critics, is what you're saying?
Yeah. And it really broke my heart. I mean, I was happy that I got a good review, but it was like, I think the line was something like 10 times or 3 times more exciting than the movie that it's about or whatever. I was just like, fuck, that was terrible. I was really upset. But the Criterion collection really, I think, put a certain good housekeeping stamp on the film, as it were, saying like, this is art and this is worth your time. And it's interesting that you say that the Deer Hunter taught you how to watch Heaven's Gate, because I think it's harder and harder to watch movies in some ways lately, right? You have your phone sometimes, or you get distracted, unless you're in a movie theater, right? But even in a movie theater, you still have your phone. Or you have your distractions, and it's a very ADHD kind of filmmaking era, I think, in a lot of ways. And I read a lot of different things. Sometimes I'll read a magazine, sometimes I'll read Twitter, and sometimes I'll read a novel. And I want different things creatively and in terms of storytelling from the medium, right? A novel should have those digressions and those kind of emotional, more depth, say, right, than a short story.
Right.
Most of the time. And I look at Heaven's Gate as a novel, as a really very novelistic experience.
Yes.
And if you go in expecting a video game, you're just not going to like it, right? But it's a breathtaking Russian novel, is how I see it.
I think we're well in. Do we need to go over the plot of the movie? I think anyone listening to this needs, they have to have seen this by this point. It's on this.
If you can do the plot, I mean, I think that was part of Steven Bach's problem. Like, what is this movie actually about? Right? Cattle ranchers and.
Well, I mean, the basics are that it's based on the historical incident of the Johnson County War, and it's a love triangle involving Chris Christopherson playing a guy from Harvard 20 years later who's now a marshal of Johnson County. There's Nate Champion, played by Christopher Walken, who is... The Homestead Act, allowed all these ranchers to have access to land, and I guess in the East there was this land grab at that where cattle was a very big moneymaker, especially not just in the East, but overseas. And a lot of immigrants who are coming over to places in the West through the Homestead Act, there was all these accusations of stealing cattle and things like that, sometimes legitimate. And so this Eastern, what do you want to call it, conglomerate
It's
of
class
powers?
war. It's a film about class war and
Yeah,
resources.
they declare war on. They make a death list of 150 or 50 people, and with the sanction of the Wyoming government and the president of the United States. And it's 3.5 hours of Chris Christopherson periodically mentioning there's a death wish or there's a death list
in between being drunk.
and then like they dance, or something else nice happens.
Right. They do play roller skates and what have you.
Roller skates.
Brad Dourif about the roller skating practice was particularly great.
Well,
yeah.
You mentioned Bach's description of the plot. So I want to say early in the book he describes, I guess the script when it was still called the Johnson County War. It was an old script of Cimino's that was one of the things he wrote very early when he was starting his film career as this thing that was the movie you're supposed to make after you get your success. And although it's funny in the book, originally he wanted to make The Fountainhead, which yay history he didn't make. And
but really telling. Look, the thing, one of the things that people should know about the making of this film, which I find it as fascinating as the film, actually more fascinating, frankly, than the film itself, right? Because it's a kind of story of Icarus. Steven talked about, and Michael, Michael came out of advertising. That was his training.
Mm-hmm.
And he spent an enormous amount of time, as one does in advertising, making sure that the product looks perfect. And really, in a lot of ways, there is no ceiling to how much the company is willing to spend to make, the underwear or the bottle of scotch look absolutely pristine. And then he came in as a writer, and then he worked with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot under Clint Eastwood, who really was in control of that set. Michael was the director, but
he also co-wrote Magnum Force with John Milius too.
Right. So he got to start with Clint Eastwood, and then he went off and did The Deer Hunter, and that film was made for Universal, and it was really hated by the studio. The studio saw a cut of The Deer Hunter and freaked out and took it away from Michael and edited it down from 3.5 hours to like an hour and a half. And there was a huge fight, and Michael convinced the studio to test screen both prints, their print, their short cut, and his long cut. And test audiences hated the studio cut and loved Michael's long cut. And then that long cut went on to sweep the Oscars. Michael got Best Director, I think Best Screenplay. I know Best Picture.
He rewrote the screenplay, and then I think there's some like argument over credit on that. Yeah.
But basically, the narrative for Michael was that The Deer Hunter validated that he was always right and the studio was always wrong.
And this was like in the middle of, they were near finalizing, or they pretty much, UA had already decided to make the movie at this point, and they were near finalizing.
Not yet. No. When The Deer Hunter did so well, Michael became the director in Hollywood, and everybody came to him. And at that point, the people who had started UA, well, not started, but who had made UA really great in the 70s, Arthur Krim in particular, who had, and you're talking about Woody Allen and Scorsese and Coppola. The Conversation was made there, and Apocalypse
To a lesser
Now.
extent, Richard Lester's mentioned a bunch in the book.
Yeah,
they got the Bond movies.
Right. So the Bond movies, which really I think are like the future of Hollywood, right? So if you think about like Hollywood history, this is in a moment where the director is the center of the universe, and where you wouldn't go see, I don't know, now we don't really go see actors, right? We go see characters. But once upon a time, a star, Tom Cruise or whatever, could open a
Mhm.
movie, Julia Roberts. This was in a moment when a director could open a movie. You went to see a Francis Ford Coppola film or a Scorsese film, and now you're going to see a Michael Cimino movie. And Krim left because he got in a fight with the corporate overlords. And
They got
Transamerica.
bought by Transamerica. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And Krim left to go start a studio called Orion. And Woody Allen went with him over to Orion, and a bunch of other people left. And so Steven Bach and a guy named David Field, who were both, kind of nobodies, right? They hadn't really any experience. They were all of a sudden in charge of the most storied, or one of the most storied, independent
The one studio that was created by creatives. It was
right.
It was Chaplin, Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks.
Yeah, and it was the studio if you were, a filmmaker you wanted to be. It was the place that said, "Here's your budget. So long as you don't go over budget, we don't give a fuck. Go make your film. We'll see you when you're done." Right? And who doesn't like that? The downside was you didn't have as much money maybe as you did somewhere else, but you had creative and artistic freedom. So they go to Michael, and they figure they're going to make their name. They're going to get the it guy coming right off the Oscar. They're going to stake their claim to continuing to be a home for filmmakers. And they're going to do that with Michael Cimino, and they give him carte blanche. And he goes off to make the Johnson County War and destroys everyone's career.
The funniest thing I love about the book is how it details the very small, tiny flaw in their strategy that no one could have foreseen, but they didn't have a Christmas movie for 1979.
Yeah.
And so they make this clause that gives him a little bit of money, extra money, without restriction, or the normal director overage restrictions where if you go over budget, it comes out of profit participation or whatever your fees are, things like that. They waive it for him. And Cimino just spends money, especially for the first half of the shoot, for the first 3 months of the shoot. That's only a 12-week shoot, I think, or something like that.
Like a drunken sailor. He was 14 days over budget. Or over schedule, whatever, 10 days into production. So 10 days in, he was 14 days over.
Well, okay, here's one point I think that it's interesting, the story behind the making of this, but when you watch this movie now, I've used this quote before. A friend of mine, when we were working on a movie, there was a big debate over the music cue, and the producer came at him about how expensive the music cue is going to cost, but they were talking about how everyone agreed it was going to be a great music cue. And my friend very sarcastically said, in 100 years, you know what they're going to say? They're going to look at how this movie came in on budget.
Right.
When you look at, even Bach mentions in the book multiple times, you see all the movie on the money on screen.
Oh yeah, Michael didn't pocket anything. There's no fraud here. I don't want to,
Yeah.
He was obsessed with making a brilliant film, and he did.
And Bach even mentions multiple times, he goes to these technical people working on the movie. Everyone agrees this movie's very efficiently made. It's just that there's many takes on perfection and waiting for different, cloud cover or different weather or.
That was my favorite.
But the painterliness of this movie shows. And
oh my God. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing
shot after shot after shot is a work of art. Absolutely. Yeah. My favorite, Penny Sylvester. So I don't know if you know Penny Sylvester. She was the assistant editor in post, and then she was on set as one of Michael's assistants. So she was the only person, or one of a very, very few handful of people who saw the production of Heaven's Gate through production and post-production. She went through the whole thing with Michael.
I always say the assistant editor is the person to knows where all the bodies are buried. So
yeah, and she was the most fun I've ever had in an interview. She was great, and she is she's still with us. Robert Shaw's daughter.
Really?
Yeah. Right. And she was great. So she was there on set this one day, and, you know, all of the extras have to get made up. So they're showing up, and we can talk about, I mean, there's some of these things are just, these stories are madness, what he put everybody through to get to these breathtaking images. Cause there's no effects, right? There's no,
Yeah.
there's no green screen. It's all practical stuff on, and everybody's underwear is period specific, and their socks and everything. But anyway, everybody was on set one day, and he didn't like the way the cloud cover was, and he knew what was coming, and Phil Motion was like, Michael, everybody's hungry. We need to break for lunch, because, you know, they had been there for like 7-8 hours. And Michael just turned to him like he was crazy. And he said, lunch? Are you crazy? You know, in 10 years, nobody's going to be talking about lunch. They're going to be talking about the cloud in this shot that we're going to get. And we're going to wait until we get it. And 3 hours later, they got it. And they went like way, way over that day. But they shot like, I don't know, like what ended up being like a minute of film for the cloud cover.
I think of that. Okay. So there's different iterations between the Criterion version and what I guess you would call the premiere cut. And the most notable thing is that the intermission is taken out of the premiere cut.
Yeah.
The first shot, I know I looked up Glenn Erickson's review of this, and he pointed out that he missed the intermission, which I agreed with him, just because it ends with that great shot of John Hurd doing his poetry on the horse, where the smoke comes in, and somehow after the smoke comes by, he disappears, and then it goes into intermission.
How great is that shot? How amazing is that?
But then the shot going after intermission is just you see the cloud moving over. It's when I forget the Irish the man that's the not the postmaster, but he's the man in charge with the trains.
Right.
He's sleeping underneath. I don't understand why he's sleeping underneath that wood, except he's running to warn people. And oh my God, the next 3 shots are all wides that take a really long amount of time, but you just see the cloud moving, and yeah, film is forever.
And you think like, thank God he did that. I mean, you know, because you don't really worry about lunch. Did they get their lunch break? The making of are good stories. You know, Brad Dourif, who is who's a great actor, he talked about how the place that they picked for the final battle sequence right at the end was a 3-hour car ride from Kalispell. Right. So there's this battle sequence, which takes like 40 minutes in the movie at the end. I mean,
and then in the early cuts, they said it was like a 90-minute version in the 5-hour version.
No. It was, Steven told me that after all the cost overruns, after all the bad publicity, which I think really Steven's failure to manage publicity or the Hollywood press is what cost the movie.
That totally makes sense.
Right. And, you know, I think one of the interesting things about COVID is we've stopped talking about box office.
You know, one big note I had, when was the last time you heard someone complain about the most expensive movie of all time? It probably would have been Avatar, right?
Yeah. And like, it's not my money. Like, why does everybody care about how much a movie costs? Like,
the thing that rereading Steven Bach's book, really, I found a ton of things quaint, but the obsessive, you mentioned earlier, UA was a smaller studio that gave everyone control, but you may not have access to money. But the numbers he was throwing, so the narrative always goes, the Easy Rider Raging Bull narrative is that these directors went out of control and spent too much money, and the American New Wave of the 70s had to end because they spent too much money.
Right.
But in this rereading, I found it fascinating. He keeps bringing up inflation, and he keeps talking about how they did a Bond movie for a certain like 11 million or 15 million, and like 3 years later they do another budget, and because of inflation, the budget goes up to like 19 million or 20 million. And I find it fascinating that inflation seems to have killed American politics and killed the American
Yeah.
film in the 70s, both in the 70s, just to give a counteractive to that narrative.
People forget, man, inflation was insane in the late 70s, right? I mean, it wasn't quite Buenos Aires, but,
Mm.
until Paul Volcker killed inflation in the early 80s,
The
um,
Volcker rule.
the Volcker with, you know, where I think prime, which was what the banks charge each other, right, or what the Fed charges banks, was like 13 or 14%, which means people got mortgages that were like 23, 24% was the mortgage on your house, right?
Wow.
More than your credit card today. And that killed inflation, and it never came back. But the thing for me that always, I mean, like Moonraker was a potential debacle. There was all of these runaway budgets at the time.
He mentions at one point a bunch of movies going around the time that were huge budgets that had grown exponentially. He mentions 1941, Blues
Yeah.
Brothers, The Wiz, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Race the Titanic, and as we mentioned earlier, Reds.
Yeah. So all of these movies just go completely haywire. And look, I really disagree with the Raging Bull notion that the director's cost overruns sunk the director-driven model. What Hollywood is always about putting $1 in and wanting to get $5 out, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about finding the sure bet. And so if you go back far enough, the studio system was a sure bet. You make a movie, you have vertical integration, you own the theaters, you make your money by the time it gets out of the movie theater and you're done. And by the late 60s, they had to divest from their movie theaters, right? And so they have to actually make films that people want to see. And by the late 60s, the boomers are the young kids, and they don't want to see Hello Dolly or Dr.
Yeah,
Dolittle or the
they
kinds
don't
of
want to see road
movies,
shows.
right? The kind of movies that the old guard knew how to make. And then you get things like Bonnie and Clyde and things like Easy Rider that Hollywood, and frankly, a lot of foreign films like Bicycle Thieves and the like, that younger generation at the time loved and flocked to. And Hollywood was stymied. They didn't know how to create films for that market, but a younger generation of directors did. Right, Scorsese did, and Coppola really did. I mean, Coppola was
Mm-hmm.
probably the best at it for a time, and so it felt like a good financial investment to say, this is a director-driven film, because that's why people bought tickets to go see the movie, right? Until the late 70s, when it stopped being such a sure thing, right? 1941 was a big flop. That was Steven Spielberg. Reds lost an ungodly amount of money for Paramount. This stopped seeming like a sure bet. And what started to seem like a sure bet were the actors. So you just went from one kind of cost overrun to the next, because now you're
Mm.
giving Arnold Schwarzenegger or Bruce Willis or Julia Roberts, or
The Easy Rider Raging Bull theory is that Star Wars and Jaws, with a wide
right.
release, was what it would guarantee more money and give you your corporations would then find easier what now we're at is like it just what your
Yeah.
quarterly projections are going to match. But what I find fascinating is that the numbers in the 80s still stayed high, but suddenly they don't give a shit about if it's a director going over, or they
Yeah,
do,
I
but it's
think
things
it's
like again, we don't remember today, like Cotton Club or something like that,
right. I think
or
it's a
Popeye.
facile, stupid argument, to be honest. I didn't like the book at the time. Look, Star Wars was a auteur film, right? It wasn't a blockbuster film. It was like released in 16 theaters. I mean, and frankly, I think it's why so many of the sequels suck, right? Because it wasn't designed to be a franchise. It's one guy's
One
vision.
of my frequent co-hosts, Ted Haycraft, still to this day says that movie should have been one movie.
Yeah, that's it, right? I mean, the problem is the narrative doesn't extend because it's an auteur thing, right?
It's supposed to be that vague feeling of one chapter in many serials that you're only seeing the one.
Yeah, right. And it's amazing when that is, because then you don't know where it came from and where it's going, but you have imagination, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is after that, there's no imagination left. It's all spelled out stupidly for you. And Spielberg was that. Jaws was a work of an auteur. It was wildly successful, but it wasn't like all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, let's make big summer blockbusters. It was like, let's keep giving directors the tools because they're making us money. And then when they stop making money, all of a sudden, oh, if we give Julia Roberts a lot of money and she is the star, people will show up, right? And even that starts to stop. And then what ends up happening is everything becomes James Bond. That's my theory, which is we live in a world now of James Bond.
I don't know who said this, but I've gone strong with this, that the last great movies of the 70s are all movies made in the early 80s, that it's Heaven's Gate, Brian De Palma's Blowout, and Peter Bogdanovich's They All Laughed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would put Reds in there. I think Reds is 81, too, I think.
Yeah, Reds is so good.
Yeah. Warren Beatty's Reds, if you haven't seen it.
What I was getting to earlier with the Bach, so Bach bought the screenplay he bought. Speaking of auteurs, he bought the earlier version of the Johnson County War, and he describes it in the book. And he basically describes the plot points as, in theory, if you're cutting down the movie, this is what it should be. And one cut, we've talked about the theatrical cut briefly, which, although we should definitely go back into, because like I just watched this today, and it was the theatrical cut, the release cut, and then the Criterion director's cut without the intermission. But the one cut I just watched for the first time a few days ago that I've been wanting to watch for years, is available online only, is director Steven Soderbergh did his own cut that he called The Butcher's Cut.
Yeah.
Did you get around to watching it?
I've watched only a little bit of it, but it's great.
Did you get to the end?
I did not. No.
Okay. The big choices he made.
But it starts off so much better.
He tried it. I almost got the vibe that he followed Bach's description in the book of the bare points, because the movie originally opened with that really great scene, which is Christopher Walken's intro in all versions of the movie, but he opens the movie with where Christopher Walken kills the Russian immigrant by shooting him through through some hanging sheets.
Yeah.
But the real notable thing is at the ending. So the idea that Isabelle Huppert's character Ella dies at the end was a later draft thing before this Johnson County War draft that Bach's describing.
In the big shootout in the house at the end, right?
He cuts the shootout at the end. Yeah. He basically ends at the battle, and then he decides to go back to the prologue.
Right.
He goes to Harvard. He goes back to 1870 from there. And the movie ends with Blue Danube and John Hurt giving his oratory, and it just cuts out there at the end.
Yeah, it's better.
I mean, what you were saying earlier about the rhythms, the thing that always works for this movie, it's similar to like all these long rhythms. Whether it's the wedding sequence in Deer Hunter or the roller rink in Heaven's Gate, all this like. These movies have, Cimino kept calling them in the internal rhythms that were supposedly taken away by the director's cut. And even Bach admits, like, yes, I get it. They just, I'm not sure it's worth 3.5 hours. These work just because there's going to be one moment of transition where there's a surge of power. And like Heaven's Gate for me has two. One is whenever you go away from Harvard onto the train where you see Averall with like beard in the future in the pretty immigrant train. The other is Ella dying at the end, because if I haven't seen Heaven's Gate for a while, I forget what happened to Ella at the end. And every version. I mean, seriously, I watched this movie 3 times in 3 days. Every time that first gunshot is so loud and so startling. And you've been lulled into this long rhythm. And then after the battle, like less than like 3 or 4 minutes after this huge epic battle scene, do you think you got a long epilogue ahead of you or something? Or you're going to fall asleep till the credits or something? No, there's this violent gunshot that just like breaks your heart. And then Christopherson's "Oh Ella" is just such an amazing, heartbreaking line delivery too, and just that for me is how Cimino works. Is like I I watched multiple versions of this movie in the last three days. Like one of the quotes I had from the
really impressive.
One of the quotes I had from the Bach book, two actually, was he quotes Pauline Kael, and Pauline Kael says, "While watching the 3 hour and 39 minute Heaven's Gate, I thought it was easy to see what to cut, but when I tried afterward to think what to keep, my mind would break."
So they had suffered all this terrible press during production, which I think is profoundly unfair. Unfair to the film, unfair to Michael, and it gets back to what we were talking
very
about.
Facile and not that observant too.
Again, who gives a shit how much a movie costs? It doesn't cost you any more to go see it. They're not charging you $20 instead of $10, right? So what difference does it make? And why is everybody so up in arms about it? I've never understood it. I also never really understood why studios tell you the box office. Like, I don't like a movie more because it's made more money in a box office or less because it's bombed. But we look at film now through the prism of business. It's like, art at least or commerce, entertainment of a movie is about whether or not it was a financial flop or not. And interestingly enough, streaming's kind of taken that away, right? Nobody really asks questions anymore about production costs. But I think in some ways that's bad. We've lost a lot. I mean, COVID for sure with movies.
Right.
But so Steven, after all of this terrible, terrible, terrible press and a year of post-production, right, where they were literally locked out of the edit room. Like they were padlocks on the doors. They couldn't get in.
There were?
Yeah, like Michael wouldn't let anybody anywhere near the edit room. He fired an editor, but the union wouldn't let him fire the editor, so the editor would just come in for work every day, just do an empty, Steenbeck. And so Michael came in, Steven says, for the first screening for the studio. And David Field has left now. David, who was Steven's partner in greenlighting the film originally. And he says, it's a little long, but I can easily cut 15 minutes, right?
This is a great moment in the book.
It's an astonishing moment. And the movie that he screened for them was 5.5 hours long. And the battle sequence itself was longer than most motion pictures were that year. Just the battle sequence.
I will say, I first read this in college and reread it just a few days ago. I have a massive difference in the interpretation of what I thought was shocking in a post-production environment then in college versus now, where it's like, that just seems quaint to me. There's so much in there that seems quaint. The quote was, and I think this is more I think a great description of the theatrical cut, which I watched today, was the picture was shorter, clearer, and more watchable, but whether it was better, I didn't know. Cimino had been right to assert that he had built rhythms into the picture from the start of production, and they showed in the movement of a crane shot, the deliberation with which the actors walked or spoke. The recut epic was a masterful job of editing by Bill Reynolds, but there were odd moments where it seemed almost meager, like a man whose crash diet had left him with a baggy wardrobe or too tight, like a face lifted to a new and not quite natural configuration. And the thing is, any editor who's ever been tasked with the idea of cutting something down that's too long that the director won't cut down themselves knows exactly what this is when they watch the version, just because like it's dialogue sequences where lines of dialogue, they make them keep all the lines of dialogue in, but they're tighter. There's no spaces in between them except like 1 or 2 times where you put a space in just to make it seem like it's still real speech. But the rhythms are just sped up in the theatrical version.
It's a terrible injustice done to the film. I mean, the idea that you have I think the film was never really given a chance, right? Because how something is presented to you is in some way how you're going to receive it. So, you get the stories of massive cost overruns and this sort of Kurtz-like figure out in the middle of Montana, and it hits the theaters, and they rushed it for Christmas, which they never ever should have done. It was literally right out of the soup. And, I don't think it was given a clean, fresh air, right? When
they seem to freak out from those first reviews, from the longer version.
Yeah, and those first reviews were unfair. I mean, the Vincent Canby review that the film is like a 3.5 hour walking tour of your own living room.
Or in Bach even keeps pointing out, like, Canby used the phrase disaster, and even Bach, who I think this rereading really made clear to me, like, he was just sick of the film by a certain point, and was not, and he's definitely not going to, like, this book is the narrative with which a lot of everyone views this film, and it's not the best one to look at it through. Just because he had to deal with Cimino constantly, like, promising something and, like, not delivering on a promise that would lose Bach his job. But, like, he says at one point, Canby quotes it as a disaster, and he's like, "It's not a disaster."
Oh, the thing. First of all, the thing about Final Cut, as much as I love the book, is the book's got almost nothing about filmmaking in it. Because Steven's
really doesn't. No,
Steven's not on the set. So it's all about back in Los Angeles, right? It's all about the business mechanics of it all, and what was happening in the boardroom and things like that. So, I mean, if you really it's a business book more than it is a filmmaking book.
That's fair. That makes sense.
But I think that's also typical of how Heaven's Gate for decades has been seen. Right, it's the biggest flop. It's a business folly, and it's not. And again, I just keep coming back to this notion: like, when you go to Rome and you look at do you sit there and say, "Well, how much did it cost the Pope for Michelangelo to make the Sistine Chapel?" Not that it's the Sistine Chapel, but still, like, it's the worst possible way to determine whether you like a movie or not, which is how much did it cost. I mean, like, when you read a book, do you sit there and say, how many years did it take the author to write it? Like, does it matter?
I think, and part of right now the enjoyment of Heaven's Gate, the big difference. So I watched the premiere version. I didn't rewatch the Criterion version, but over the last few years, I've watched that one.
Yeah. I liked the John Kirk one with the intermission the most, the MGM.
I like that in theory, and I think that's my favorite cut of this, but the one I feel like to recommend still is the Criterion, just because it's the Blu-ray, and, like, because Zoomman didn't seem like he was involved with it. Cimino, from what I read, sounded like he did a digital 4K master of it that was completely digital, and they got rid of a lot of the brown sepia into the movie that Zygmunt wasn't really involved with it. But that being said, just to see a Blu-ray, a really pristine Blu-ray of this movie, you see all the money on screen, and you see these painterly images. This is like Barry Lyndon level of just, like, every shot of painting, just gorgeosity.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just love Vilmos so much, and I think that he was so fundamental to the look as the cinematographer. I still think the MGM DVD, which granted is not the same thing as the Blu-ray in terms of just kind of detail. The
sepia look is really interesting, though. Yeah, and I think I wonder if there was a Blu-ray restoration of that. I think might be my preferred version.
Yeah, Michael, I don't think would have allowed that. Criterion sort of really brought Michael in, and they actually contacted me and said, we would love the documentary, and then Michael killed that idea. He just absolutely he hated any association with the book. Was, I think, the bottom line.
I was going to ask, do you know what he thought of the book?
He hated it. He hated it and hated Steven. Because, if you read the book, it's an amazing story, and it is among the best books. I actually think it's the best book about the business of movie making, right?
I can get behind that. It's the best executive book. I think I put it as my top two books about movie making. It and Julie Salmon's Devil's Candy about the making of Bonfire of the Vanities.
Right.
Those are the two. Like they're just so goddamn entertaining.
They're
Those are
great.
the books that are so much. Or Final Cut is not better than the movie, but Devil's Candy is better than Bonfire of the Vanities.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Julie Solomon's book, as brilliant as it is, she was a Wall Street Journal reporter, so she was something of an outsider. The thing about Final Cut is it is
Insider.
It costs Steven his life, right? So the author of the book pays a heavy price for the story. He is banished from Hollywood. He leaves Hollywood and he ends up going to Columbia and it becomes a biographer. He just starts writing. Steven died a couple of years ago after finishing his definitive Leni Riefenstahl book. He was living in Munich at the time. So there's something about Heaven's Gate and Final Cut in that people who are associated pay a very, very, very heavy toll. Christopherson effectively stopped working. He had done Star Was Born, and but he didn't survive Heaven's Gate. Jeff Bridges did, but really he was kind of it. And that's because I think people really love Jeff Bridges.
Isabelle Huppert, it's funny how she's aged well, and everyone, there's this declaration of, especially after a few years after that Verhoeven movie, that she's still one of the best actresses in the world. I did find reading Bach's descriptions of her early on, that didn't age well.
No, terrible. And look, there was a huge fight over the casting of Isabelle Huppert. And They were like, what the hell are we doing? This is not a star. This isn't bankable. What's a French woman doing as a prostitute in the West?
Which that's still in your doc he kind of says that. I wrote that line down and I was just like, this is a story about immigrants. It's not beyond stretch. In the book he does say Ella's not is an Anglo-Saxon name. Why would a French woman play that? But he describes her in the book as looking like a potato. And then when he met her in person, he says that she's just like the Pillsbury Doughboy. To her credit, when he finally starts seeing dailies, he's like, she is the best. She's part of the best part of this movie, or the best cast part.
She's great in the movie. She's great in the movie.
Oh my God.
They were absolutely wrong. But
it goes back to that Harvey. It goes to the Harvey Weinstein thing for me of he used to not cast women because he says would I want to fuck them? And it's just he would describe certain women where just beyond the misogyny of the statement, you just want to be like, I don't agree with your aesthetic taste on this either. They're beautiful women. Isabelle Huppert is just absolutely astoundingly gorgeous in this movie, on top of being an amazing actress in it.
Yeah, I don't know what Steven was gay, so I don't know what his motivation was.
She looked like a potato to him.
She looked like a potato to him. David Field would tell you that, and this is the way that it's told in my film and in the book, that the real outcome of the Isabelle Huppert casting fight was that Michael won. And he stood up to David and to Steven, who wanted a more bankable U.S. star, right? They wanted someone like Jane Fonda in the role at the time.
Or Diane Keaton, they keep mentioning.
Right? And Michael didn't, and he won. And he won because the executives at UA didn't back Steven and David. And they didn't back him because they thought that Isabelle Huppert was going to have box office in the international market. And so it was just an entirely a bean counter decision. And after that, David Field is convinced that Michael just stopped listening to anybody, saying no to anything. And that's when the cost overruns really went out of control.
Okay, I got a few more questions. I got one big wind down question, but first, go into the book. Are you familiar with the Okay, Bach outlines 5 options whenever the movie starts going out of control. He outlines these 5 options of what they can do. Option 1 is based on Cleopatra, where they could just keep letting them spend money. Option 2 is based on Apocalypse Now, which they just did, where I forget who they wanted to send, whether it was David Fields or not, or who, that just basically to redo the budget, which, to be fair, is kind of what they ended up doing after a certain point. But his model of that is that Coppola was receptive, and Coppola dealt with these acts of God between Martin Sheen's heart attack and the typhoon in the Philippines. Option 3 was...
Right. The option, the Apocalypse Now option was to somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat.
Okay.
That was because Apocalypse Now was
a success for them in a year.
Oh, it was a huge success. And it was also a wildly, wildly, wildly expensive production that, one of the great documentaries, by the way, ever made about
Heart of Darkness. Yeah.
Holy shit, man. Is that a great film?
The option 3 was based on the von Stroheim movie. Is it Sweet Angel?
Yeah.
Where it was basically abandoned. And it's the movie that shows up in Sunset Boulevard, where Gloria Swanson is watching her the movie. Option 4 is to sell it to another studio, which early on, because Cimino has a relationship with EMI and
which is
Warner's also excited about the movie. He keeps saying he's going to sell it to them. It becomes a big drama point. But option 5 is the one I want to talk to you about, because it's this interesting point in the book that's always intrigued me. Option 5 is to fire Cimino and hire another director.
Right.
So there's this scene in the book where Bach goes to another director. He meets him in Malibu. The director's working on a movie. And they go through a conversation about what's going on. Bach has this line of, after seeing the dailies, that he sells everyone on the movie that it's like David Lean made a Western, and he changes it for this director to say, it's like you made a Western. But my question is, do you have an idea who the director is?
Yeah, God, I wish you would ask me.
I have an idea, but I want to hear yours first. He mentions that it's a famous director. The guy smokes a cigar. He's in post-production on a movie around 1979. He's made movies for UA, and he lived in Malibu. He's an Oscar winner, or he worked on an Oscar-winning movie. I'm assuming it's a he.
It is.
And he...
God, he told me this who it was years ago. I can't remember. Who do you think it is? And I'll tell you if you're right.
Norman Jewison.
It is. Correct.
Yes.
That is
okay, because
correct.
the detail I thought that sealed it was he says that he replaced another world-famous director, and Jewison replaced Sam Peckinpah on The Cincinnati Kid. And I'm like, I think I got it.
Right. That is correct. That is 100% correct.
Oh, wow. Wow, Michael, you just made... Wow.
I'm glad to hear that.
That's amazing.
And Jewison turned him down.
Yeah, because he does that really cool stuff where he's like, I can't be hearing this. And then Bach's like...
Yeah, no, because there's a whole set of rules for the Directors Guild, right?
Right.
Where you are not allowed to have that conversation unless the director has already been fired. Because the studio can't fire a director thinking that there's somebody waiting in the wings.
I guess that makes sense.
You're not allowed to undermine somebody else in your guild. You don't undermine your own.
Yeah, I think this book is just kind of a
look. That's so Jewison
outlier situation, I guess, what you would call it.
Right, but Jewison would have been had that been made public at the time, that he would have been sanctioned by the Directors Guild, and he wouldn't have, because he didn't do anything wrong. But
there's not a lot of great stories of directors replacing other directors that worked out for everybody too.
No, God, no. No,
I would be remiss. I think Bach also details the real history, and he has this love-hate relationship with pointing out where Cimino defied history, although he used real characters' names. Averill was a general store owner who maybe went to Cornell, and he was maybe common law married to Ella, who was not French but was from Kansas. They both got lynched. Because Averill wrote to the newspapers complaining about the land situation. Nate was actually killed. He was an association cowboy who may have become an outlaw. But the character played by Mickey Rourke, Nick Ray, those were actually the only two people that were killed in the Johnson County War. The Johnson
Right.
County War was not a war. What happened was when they brought the people in, I think the Johnson County members that were on the list surrounded them in like a hotel or something. Canton was a former Johnson County sheriff who was got thrown out and was pissed off. Walcott, the captain, the military guy that was friends with the president, he might have actually started the war in the first place because it was based on unpaid debts in Britain. Billy, played by John Hurt, was an Easterner, but he's involved in Wyoming Republican politics. And again, no war. There was no battle at the end.
The Johnson County War was no war. But that's okay. It's Hollywood, man.
When you get to that battle at the end, it hit me even today watching the theatrical cut. I was late. It's three movies and three watching this 3 times in 3 days, and like the theatrical cut still kind of worked ish for me. But like when you get to the battle at the end, you watch how just like immaculate and astonishing that filmmaking in the battle is. How can you call that a disaster? How can you be like a critic's just I don't get it.
I'm very grateful that that movie is made. I urge people, if they haven't seen it, to go see it and to not concern themselves with the cost of the production or the story. I mean, the story is it's a great freaking story. It's a great story about it, all the machinations. But, I keep coming back, like, who cares? And it works or it doesn't work. And if you walk in to anything being told, oh, this is a disaster, it's a financial disaster, it cost the studio this, it cost these people, it ended an era of director-driven films. It's going to color how you see it. And I don't think it's fair. Look, I think what ended the director-driven is not Jaws, and it isn't Star Wars. It's the fact that by the late 70s, early 80s, these films were incredibly expensive to make, and audiences were not showing up, but they were showing up for actors. But look, that era ended, right? There was a moment when you would pay someone $25 million because they could deliver an opening weekend box office. But then eventually Eddie Murphy made Pluto Nash, right? So he went from Beverly Hills Cop to Pluto Nash.
Edited by a former guest on this podcast, Paul Hirsch.
Yeah.
I bring up multiple episodes.
Right. And, so it no longer made sense. And so Hollywood only cares about the sure thing. If I'm going to invest in a movie, am I going to get my money back? Am I going to make money? And I'm of the opinion that out of this whole era, the model that ended up surviving was James Bond, which is serialized endlessly. And it does not really in the end matter who plays James Bond, right? So you have one James Bond with Sean Connery. You have another James Bond with Roger Moore. Today you have Daniel Craig, who I absolutely adore as James Bond, right? Mm-hmm. It's like Batman, right? There's a million different Batmans out there. And it doesn't really matter because it's always Batman. So either it's a good Batman movie or it's a lousy Batman movie. But it almost doesn't matter who the actor is playing Batman, right? We can argue it back and forth, but you'll still go because it's Spider-Man, right? There are three different Spider-Mans, right? So far,
Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and the current Marvel one,
right? Tom Holland.
His name.
Tom Holland. Okay, so
not to forget the guy from the 70s TV show.
Right. But the point is that it's Spider-Man, right? So either you like some or you dislike others, but that's the model now that Hollywood's got. Yeah. Because I don't have to bank on Tom Holland every single time. Like if he goes away, I'll just cast somebody else as Spider-Man.
The weird following is like, and it comes from the comic book iteration of these serializations where like your writers and your creators, your artists or your directors are only part of the puzzle, but the editors and then the people involved are the ones that are constantly rebooting this whenever sales go down. And like that format is going to the movies right now.
That is to me the great tragedy at Cimino, which is that if you make movies and do right, you need a collaborator. You need to be open to another voice, either on set or really in the edit room, to say this isn't working or this could be better. You know, I'm not sure the Scorsese would be Scorsese without Thelma Schumacher, and I don't think Martin Scorsese would disagree with that, right? She's a genius. She's brilliant at filmmaking, and Coppola, you know, the same. Walter Murch is a breathtaking filmmaker, right? He's an editor, but he's a filmmaker. He's, I think, as much an auteur as any director. And I think that Michael didn't listen to anybody. And he needed, it didn't matter. He had Vilmos on set, and that was great. But, you know, the difference with The Deer Hunter is that I think he had De Niro, and he didn't have somebody who he was a little bit afraid of, who he wasn't really, you know, who was higher on the pecking order than him. And in post-production, he didn't have anybody. He didn't collaborate. And if you don't collaborate, you're not really tight.
Okay. I wanted to I have a question coming out of this, but I didn't want to wind down the best iteration of the movie for you. For me, I think it's got to be a combo after watching these last 3 days. I totally completely forgot to tell you when we were going back to my history of watching the movie. This is gonna be a long walk, but when I was I don't like smoking pot or anything like that, but a few months ago I put in the Criterion and took an edible, and I've been trying that with random movies lately. And
that's interesting.
I thought, but here's the funny thing. I thought it was the greatest movie of all time. And I asked my pothead friends, like, does this happen to you all the time? Do you think every movie's great? And they're like, no. And I said, do you think the Heaven's Gate is the greatest movie ever? And they're like, no. And then I realized it wasn't the edible that made the difference. It was that I turned on the subtitles.
Yes. Oh, we haven't talked about that. For sure.
Yeah. There was the moment where
that's a huge problem with the film.
Where Nate and Averill have like their confrontation, I think one of their first confrontations, and Nate says, like, you act like a man with a paper asshole, and then Averill's like, you've been stretching your legs under my table too long. And those two lines together while I was kind of high was like, this is the greatest movie ever. My best version of this movie is the theatrical really overcompensated with trying to clarify dialogue into the fact where the lines sounded dubbed. On top of the fact that like the rhythms of this movie felt too tightly cut, maybe tightish cut. It felt like all the lines were dubbed. And I think my best version of the movie would be the premiere version with the intermission to watch for the first time would be with the clarity of that dialogue emphasis version of it, where the soundtrack and the lines were heard.
Right.
But
that's the John Kirk restoration version.
Yeah, I think that's the best cut, or what was shown at the premiere, basically. This gets to an idea that I've had lately, though, that, and it's the way I've been enjoying Heaven's Gate the last few years, is that a really long movie, once you don't feel like you have to commit that period of time, you can watch it in chunks, you know what's going to happen with the movie, or even if you have to sit and watch it all the way through, just as long as you know when the ending's coming and what you have left. Like, really long movies are always better the second or third time if you know there's actual quality to them. One real distinct screening I had a few years ago was watching Tarkovsky's Stalker the second time. And I'm a big Tarkovsky fan, but the first time like was a chore, and the second time I remember thinking it was super short, super entertaining. Right. And it's a Tarkovsky movie. Like
Solaris. Solaris, man.
Yeah, I mean all these the watching them a second time when you don't have to feel that, like, you know, watching your watch, when am I getting out of the theater? When like you can enjoy it.
Yeah, or the burden of just, you know, what am I supposed to be thinking, right? Something that's received wisdom where you can decide for yourself.
Yeah, you know what's going to happen.
Right. I think you're right about the audio, by the way. I mean, I think if you're a young filmmaker or an older people do not think about audio anywhere near enough. Anywhere near enough. Sound design, dialogue. I mean, it's gotten better now, right? Because everybody's got a 5.1 at home or soundbar or something like that.
Right,
So
right,
even,
right.
But yeah, no, the audio is a huge barrier for that film. I mean, you just can't hear the dialogue for the first theatrical cut. It's impossible.
When I watched the cut the other night, I watched it with my my mom or my stepmom and my dad, and I think I'd seen Heaven's Gate maybe 6 times by this point, 5 or 6 times. It was the first viewing I actually knew that Averill was the marshal of Johnson County.
Right.
I saw, yeah, and my stepmom asked me, "What is he doing?" I was like, "I think he's sheriff."
Right.
Like, you really do get through this movie like. It was nice watching this many times in these many days where it's like, oh, he's whipping the mayor and the mayor's firing him. And like,
yeah,
it's a basic thing you get. Clarity in editing is it's a reason why the process takes many months. You're just trying to like make sure the audience get the details without feeling like the details are being forced down their throats. But when an audience has to watch a scene and they don't know whose relationship is to what, to other characters, it becomes into this level of frustration where people then turn around, they don't say, I didn't understand this relationship. They say, the movie didn't work for me, or the movie left me cold. And these things can be fixed, which the theatrical cut does a lot to work, but it does it in these off lines. Like, I mentioned earlier, my favorite cut being Averill from Harvard to Montana, or to Wyoming.
The Soderbergh. It's a brilliant.
No. In the theatrical, there's
the
a
theatrical.
line of voiceover over it. They do that thing that, like, Apocalypse Now really started and Blade Runner kind of did, where it's like, movie's in trouble. People don't understand anything. Write a voiceover for it. Right. String everything together with the images with a voiceover.
Tell people. Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm I would say, for me, I loved Vilmos as a cinematographer, just over and over and over again. So the most pristine version that has his vision in it is, for me, the one that I always hold dear, which is the restoration that was done 20 odd.
Did you see a print of it, or?
No, they never did a print. They did a digital intermediary. So they had a negative,
so
and
that's
there was
what
a
you
couple.
would have saw playing with whenever your movie was playing.
Yeah,
Final Cut was playing.
Yeah, it was digital intermediary at the time.
That still would have been something to see, though.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the Polaroids, and to see what he was going for and what his vision was, and I think that it's a work of art, and still has the intermission in it.
So my last question is, what do you think? It's a broad question. What do you think would have happened if Heaven's Gate had in Cimino's intended version had either saved face or made money? What if it was not this movie that brought down UA? Because the tragedy to me, the thing that I did find kind of resentful about the book being the framing of the story on top of the idea that the New York press narrative of this was the movie that took down UA, was that Cimino, above all things, he was like, he was spending money to make something that lasted. And so maybe he had a talent in spending other people's money, but at the same time, he made stuff that could have made more stuff that lasted.
Well, he didn't put it in his pocket for sure. He made a movie, and he dedicated himself for 2 years to making the best goddamn movie that he could make. I came away feeling like the failure was inevitable because they lost control of the narrative. And you look at a political campaign, right? When you lose control of the narrative, or where there's a vacuum and it's filled by somebody else, you're doomed. And it's not just that you have to be a good storyteller in the actual film you're making and the story you're telling. You have to control the narrative of your own life as well. And Michael and Steven were terrible at it. They were just terrible at it. So when Michael had an opportunity to resurrect the film when it came out, and he went on the Today Show and he did all these things, he was awful at it. And he was even awful with me. Like, I love the movie, and I got MGM to restore it for the first time in 20 years, and he wouldn't talk to me. And eventually you're like, dude, this is why it failed, right? Which is, you have to, I don't want to say suck up to me, but if you don't tell your story, if you leave a vacuum, someone like Steven Bach's going to fill it, right? With something else other than what you want, or Rona Barrett, or, some Vincent Canby, or somebody else. And what Michael needed to say was, who cares what it cost or how long it took to make? It's still, the ticket price is the same. Go enjoy the movie. I'm not charging you anymore. UA isn't charging you anymore. And stop asking yourselves, it's not like you're buying a work of art that you're hanging in your house or your apartment, right? It's not like a bowl that you're buying at IKEA, right? And you're looking at the price, and that bowl is more expensive. It's a movie, and it doesn't matter how much it costs to make. And I'm of the opinion that what sundered Heaven's Gate ended up really costing us something profound in American movie making, because for generations we became obsessed with the business of movie making rather than movie making itself, and storytelling and the art of it. And it's the very American story, right? We're obsessed with money. We're obsessed with worth comes from how much money you have, or how quickly you've grown your stupid Silicon Valley app startup thing, or whatever the stupid thing is. And in fact, I think as a society, think people have more worth if they have more money, right? And there should be some place where that, I don't care in business, right? If you want to say, oh, you're, somebody's more successful on Wall Street because they've made more money, fine, whatever. Or in Silicon Valley, whatever. But don't take that into art, right? And I grant you that Hollywood is a business, right? And I don't want to overly romanticize it. It's a business, right? They don't make movies for charity, right? They make movies to make money.
But part of my thing that bugs the shit out of me, that movies that this illustrates, is that a lot of that first wave of press about box office and what the effects were for at least a good 20, 30 years, to a certain extent today, is so goddamn short term. It's about what this movie did the week after it came out. And this Heaven's Gate is a movie that lasts.
Who knows what anybody's movie was opening weekend anymore? Look, Star Wars opening weekend sucked, right? It opened up in no movie theaters.
Right.
It's a totally, Star Wars came out, 77, right? So
yeah,
I remember going to see it 3 times that summer. My parents thought I was absolutely insane. I was really, really, really young, right? I saw that in Annie Hall endlessly that year. And they really sort of set my taste in movies forever. But the emotional thrill as a young kid, barely 10, of seeing Star Wars in the movie, it was just so transformative. It just moved you away. Or when I remember leaving the theater seeing Reds, right? Or any number of movies over the years. Last couple of years, last time when I saw Parasite, walking out of the movie theater. And
I do have to ask you, what is it like seeing Annie Hall at 10?
It was great because my parents decided that I was ready to see an adult movie. And so the adult movie they were going to take me to was Annie Hall.
You know nothing of my work.
Yeah. Marshall
McLuhan, man.
Marshall McLuhan. I remember obviously the cocaine, sneezing into it, and her getting a teddy for her birthday because I was 10 years old, right? And there was a lot of crap that I missed that I got later and later and later. But look, I know he's forbidden now, but man, I love that guy Love and Death to me is It's like his version of Revolver, right? It's in between the pure Beatlemania and Sergeant Pepper. It's like that sweet spot of funny and smart. I love Love and Death. I love that movie.
So you mentioned Final Cut has issues with your film. Final Cut has issues with the clips, so why is it probably done on DVD?
Yeah.
Is there anything else you're working on right now, or anything else that you wanted to push right?
Well, I haven't done anything about movies for a very, very, very long time.
Okay.
I did a couple films for American Masters, but like a generation ago, like forever ago. So, if people want to see my most recent film, which is already at this point a couple years old, Netflix has is streaming for another year or 2 years, I think. I forget how long the license is. Above Us Only Sky, which is about John Lennon and the making of the Imagine LP.
I watched that.
That's me.
I didn't know that was you.
That was me. So I have a second. That's the second film I did about John. The first one was called Lennon NYC. So that was the one where I got to meet and I don't want to say befriend, but got to know Yoko and earn her trust. And so Above Us Only Sky is about a year in the life of after the Beatles broke up while John was making his second solo album, Imagine. And I was given this trove of never before seen home movies of John and Yoko in the studio and in Tittenhurst Park to make. And my Cimino obsession is I spent 15 years of my life reporting and filming what ended up being the longest and most expensive criminal investigation in U.S. military history that ended up documenting a massive government cover-up. And so it's a podcast now because the film was made, but it was too much for anybody to want to distribute. So we went to Tribeca with it. It's my version, I think, of Final Cut. It broke my heart, or my version of Heaven's Gate, I should say. But the podcast did really well. It's everywhere, like all podcasts, right? Spotify, Apple, whatever. It's called Murder in House 2. And it's about my journey into the abyss of the military justice system. And this one guy, Frank Wuterich, who was charged in something called the Haditha massacre with mass murder. He was charged with 18 counts of murder, many of them women and children. And I found a way to get into his criminal defense team and document, film it all without the government knowing or being able to access the footage I was shooting. And the kicker is this thing went on for years, and Frank was, for a while, facing life in prison and was being charged with this just horrible crime. And he couldn't remember whether he had committed it or not. He told us over and over again, in all fairness, that he absolutely didn't do it. But when he was pressed, what happened in the bedroom where all these children were lined up and executed, he couldn't remember. So that's the podcast.
That is some in cold blood shit there.
Yeah, it is. It's called Murder in House 2. It's up on Apple and Spotify and Google and whatever. Acast.
Michael Epstein, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It was a lot of fun.
I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad you're still fighting the good fight of getting this movie seen and watched by more people.
People should go see it. Shane, thanks very much, and Reds and all these other movies that we talked about.
Reds,
for sure. To go enjoy it.